industrial accidents,
ancient
solving
poisoners,
crime,
poison
chemical
prevention.
spills. This is Toxic History.
Dr. Zane Horowitz is going to be speaking with you about the Antarctic adventure of Douglas Mawson.
Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm going to be talking about Douglas Mawson. Douglas Mawson may be a name that's not particularly well known to many people in North America, so let me introduce you to him. Douglas Mawson was a geology student in the University of Adelaide in Australia. When his professor, T.W. Edgeworth David, was recruited by Shackleton to be part of an expedition to try to reach the South Pole. And this was his sort of journeyman job where he went down there. Shackleton's team was trying to go directly south to the South Pole, but being a geologist and being working with Edgeworth David, who was also a geology professor, their job was to find the magnetic South Pole, which was really nowhere near the actual South Pole, but a little bit of geology. So he did that, and he didn't lead the team. Edgeworth David led the team, brought them to the South Pole, and then Edgeworth David, being somewhat older, got snow blinded and was unable to lead the expedition. So Mawson stepped in, led his snow blinded professor back to base camp, rescued him, and afterwards, both Shackleton, who didn't make the South Pole on that trip, certainly, but both sung his praises as a up-and-coming Antarctica explorer. The next event in Mawson's life, first of all, here's a little picture that was not much of a notoriety here to be displayed in a pack of cigarettes, but here shows the magnetic pole party on the back of a pack of cigarettes that was sort of displayed in Australia at the time, and shows that the three of them, Edgeworth David and Mawson and another person, reached the magnetic pole. The next event is Mawson went to England, and he was trying to both seek funds and advice from the people who were the foremost explorers of the time. Most notably, Robert Falcon Scott was putting together his big expedition to go to the South Pole, and he offered a job as the base camp to Mawson, and Mawson turned him down. He actually offered it to him 3 times. And it was probably a good decision in retrospect, because even though Scott got to the South Pole, he was second. Amundsen had beat him, and on the way back, Scott and his entire party perished in their tents. But Mawson went back to Australia with the blessing of the Royal Geographic Society and the Australian government, and he put together his own expedition. He was actually waiting for Scott to leave so he wouldn't overshadow his expedition. And eventually, at the beginning of winter down under, November 1911, they set sail on the ship Aurora southward. They stopped at this desolate sub-Antarctic island, Macquarie Island, and they left 6 men there with equipment they had brought with them to set up a relay station so they can radio information back and forth from the Antarctic continent. Their plan was to get to Antarctica, land the remaining men, build a base camp, and then split some overland parties to explore the continent. He felt that area of the continent, being directly south of Australia, being a geologist, had incredible mineral wealth and incredible strategic importance to Australia. And his goal was not to seek a pole, but to make scientific discoveries and geologic discoveries. So here's tiny little Macquarie Island, almost halfway, more than halfway down between Hobart on Tasmania and Antarctica. And here are the bold crew of the Australian expedition. A bunch of rough and tumble men heading out for the adventure of their lifetimes. So here's the base camp, Cape Denison. They brought all the supplies. There was nothing there when they landed. They had to build all this from supplies on the ship. They put up a few huts, and they created ways to heat the huts and stores of food and everything they would need. And then they broke up into their sledging parties. There were 4 different sledging parties, and this was Mawson's party. He was the leader overall of the entire expedition, but he handpicked the people for his personal sledging party. They took 3 sledges and 18 husky dogs with them, and the other 2 people, besides Douglas Mawson was Xavier Mertz. Xavier Mertz was a Swiss ski expert. He had the ability to ski ahead and sort of reconnoiter the area and be able to help them find their way on the trip out. The other person was Belgrave Ninnis, although he had very little snow and Antarctic experience. He was the son of a Arctic Navy surgeon, and he was up for this big adventure himself. His area of expertise was he had learned how to handle husky dogs and was an expert at that form of transportation. So off they went. They were going to go from Cape Denison, heading due east, traveling up past what is now named Mertz Glacier and Ninnis Glacier. And their goal was to go as far as they could and then come back. They had instructed the ship's captain, whose name was Gloomy Davis, that he must leave by February. Otherwise, they'd get stuck with the icebergs and not be able to get out of the Antarctic continent as winter started moving in. And the other 3-4 parties all had instructions to return by February. So the sledging party goes off. And sometimes they pushed it, sometimes they rode on it. There was 3 sledges to begin with. As some of the dogs ran away, they cut this down to 2 sledges that packed all their food, almost 2 tons of food and equipment and tents and stoves with them, and they were off. And they battled what was called katabatic winds, these 90-mile-an-hour winds blowing little bits of ice into their face. And the rough ridges were called sastrugi, these ice sharp ridges that they had to bounce over and over again. And they passed over these snow bridges that covered up these deep crevasses, and they learned how to transverse them. But unfortunately, there was the first disaster that occurred on December 14th, 1912. Ninnis, the ski expert, stepped off his sledge, was on top of this thin ice bridge that they didn't know was there, and he disappeared into the crevice. He had a rope around him, and backwood pulled the sledge that he was tied to, and with it, 6 of the strongest dogs, and they were gone. He plummeted. On that sledge was the food supply, for the bulk of it, the sturdier of the 2 tents they were carrying, and half of their transportation. They yelled into the crevice. They dropped some ropes. They tried everything they could to try to figure out if he was still alive or if they can go down and get him, but all to no avail. And they stood there devastated. And they realized they were a long way from home. They recalculated their rations. They dropped it down by a quarter from 34 ounces per day to 8 ounces per day. They realized how far they had marched and how far they could march and what they had left. They did some calculations, and they knew besides eating the remainder of their rations, they needed to essentially use their means of transportation as a means of subsistence. And the first night, one of the dogs, who was already sick and weak and couldn't really go on, was killed, and they ate it. And in his journal, Mawson notes, it was a happy relief when the liver appeared. That was easily chewed. Over the next 23 days, both Mertz and Mawson tried to make as far distance as they can, but sometimes they didn't go anywhere near their goal. They only made 3 miles a day, again, fighting katabatic winds and sastrugi ridges and their weakness. They had to essentially sacrifice their dogs, and their dogs became food for them. And then Mawson realized that Mertz was not progressing as well. He started getting sick with GI symptoms and nausea, diarrhea. And eventually, on January 8th, Mawson writes in his journal, during the afternoon, he had several fits and is delirious. And he feels his trousers again and again, and I clean him out. He is very weak, becoming more and more delirious, rarely being able to speak coherently. At 8 p.m., he raves and breaks a tent pole, and I hold him down. He becomes more peaceful, and I put him quietly in the bag. He dies peacefully around 2 a.m. on the morning of the 8th. He has lost all the skin of his legs and his private parts, and I am in the same condition, and the sores on my fingers won't heal. So there Mawson was, alone on the ice. He had made it maybe halfway back to the camp. He He had decreased food. He had no companion. There were no more dogs left. Everything else from here on in would be him hauling the remainder of his supplies and fighting his way back, hopefully in time. He was truly alone on the ice. Now, his journey also was fraught with more problems. He wrote again in his journal that the sight of my feet gave me quite a shock, for the thickened skin of the sole had separated in each case as a complete layer. He had actually wrapped this with lanolin and walked on his denuded feet with his soles glued back on. He had issues with snow blindness and treated himself with some eye drops that he had. He noticed that the hair was falling out and his beard came loose in tufts. And at one point, he too fell into a crevasse, but he hung there from the rope tied to the sledge, and he came to, and hand over hand, he lifted himself up from the rope and almost made it to the top, where he slipped and fell again, dangling unconscious, thinking this was the end. One more time, he forced himself to climb up out of the crevice and continue his journey back. Unfortunately, Gloomy Davis, captain of the Aurora, was given instructions to leave by early February. He held on for one more week, hoping that Mawson and his team would come, but by February 7th, he realized he had to leave if he didn't want to get stuck in the ice floes that were moving in. The next day, Mawson, a mere skeleton of himself, on February 8th, stumbled into base camp, having lost 97 pounds on his journey. And he looked terrible, and the skin was sloughing off his face and his arms and his legs, and he was emaciated. The good news is, of course, that they had left 6 people at the base camp, hoping that Mawson, and in fact, everyone in his party, would return. Mawson had to tell them what had happened. He slowly recovered. He was nurtured back to health. He was fed. He had time to write some notes and journals and collect his thoughts. And 11 months later, the Aurora returned with the same captain and rescued 7 of them and took them back to Australia. Now, I'm not the first person to come up with the theory what had happened to Mertz. This has been written about, it seems, about every 10 years or so. The first group of folks was Sir John Cleland and Southcott, and they wrote about hypervitaminosis in the Antarctic, and several people followed with adding little bits more to the story of what went on. Certainly, the symptoms of hypervitaminosis fit with many of the symptoms that Mertz and Mawson was experiencing: the diarrhea, the hair falling out, the skin peeling off, and even the CNS symptoms, because hypervitaminosis A produces benign intracranial hypertension with headaches and visual field loss, and in fact can lead to altered mental status. The reason I got interested in it, because as part of the Alaska Poison Center, reading a little bit about histories of Alaska and the Arctic, there's an entity that the Inuit talk about called Piplaktuk. It is somewhat politically incorrectly referred to as Arctic or Inuit hysteria, but it's basically felt to be due to hypervitaminosis A, mostly from eating polar bear liver, which they advise and sort of as a taboo to not eat that part of the polar bear. But it's been described in phases. It has a prodromal phase over hours or sometimes days, with sort of irritability and sudden occurrences of eventually wild hysteria, characterized by shouting and throwing things and tearing off one's clothes and putting one at risk for harming themselves and being irrational. After that, it's usually followed by a seizure or a series of seizures. The person lapses into a coma and often dies. In a few cases, they recover. But certainly this fits very well with the few diary entries that Mawson made describing Mertz's costs as he developed this fit and the screaming fits that he had before he died. So, how much vitamin A could have Mertz had? Certainly, we know the polar bear liver has huge amounts of vitamin A in it. Antarctic husky liver, not so much. From one study, it showed here that it had just under 1 micromole per gram of liver. So we need to do a little bit of vitamin A and liver math here, just for a second. The dog's liver weighs about 0.9 kilograms. Until the vitamin A content in one study where they looked at 10 dogs was about 10,000 plus international units per gram. So doing a little bit of math, that gives us about 9.5 million international units of vitamin A per dog liver. Now, they had 6 dogs and 6 livers, and if they split them each, that would each be 5.6 kilograms of liver over 23 days. So what's toxic? Anything more than 1 million units in an acute ingestion would produce benign intracranial hypertension and the symptoms of toxicity. But the total amount of vitamin A contained in the 6 dog livers, if you've been following the math, was about 57 million international units of vitamin A. Even if you spread that out over all the days that they were eating, they each had more than that acute toxic amount, 1.2 million units of vitamin A per day. But they might not have eaten the same amount equally. People have postulated that Mertz was described in some notices as being a quote near vegetarian. And it was thought that maybe Mawson was letting Mertz eat more of the liver, which was more digestible, while Mawson ate more of the sinew and the marrow. One of the last articles speculates that, listen, Mertz was depressed. His best friend Ninnis had died. They were starving to death. They were exerting themselves. And in fact, Mawson in his journal writes during this period, Mertz was not his usual cheerful self as usual. I'm at a loss to know the reason, for he was always such a bright and companionable fellow. And then many speculated, as a book called Mawson's Will that came out in the last 20 years or so, he just had the will to live. And there's notes in Mawson's journal that he endeavored to see his dear fiancee one more time and survive his trip back. Well, the story does have a happy ending. Of course, Mawson did make it back, although it took an extra year. And March 31st, 1914, several years later, he did marry his fiancee. When I was putting this talk together, I was a little surprised because 70 years later, I too got married on that same day. No coincidence, I am sure. He went on and accumulated his notes and wrote a book about the Australasian Antarctic expedition. He published this in 3 volumes. This was a big book and a big reference book to Antarctic exploration. And it was noted with some of the photos that some of the other parties had taken. He didn't have a camera, but some of the other sledging parties did, and they were included in the book. And this book has been edited down in a more readable form by others over the years. After you get married and write a book, what's next? He journeyed to England in 1914, and he was knighted by King George V and became Sir Douglas Mawson. Afterwards, he quietly returned home to the University of Adelaide, where he took a job teaching geology. For the rest of his life, in the next 50 years, he taught there at the University of Adelaide, going once more to the Antarctic as an advisor, but no sledging journeys. Outside of the Prince Henry Gardens at the University of Adelaide, there's a statue to Douglas Mawson, noting that first he was a professor of geology and last an explorer. But Australia has honored him in other ways as well. His face and likeness appear on the Australian $100 bill and the $5 stamp. And so, the next time your family drags you to dinner to your aunties and they make liver and onions, and you're playing with your food and your mother says, Dougie, eat your food and stop playing with it, you can take a deep breath. Tell them the story. Thank you.